Jerry Schimmel was on a plane cruising towards Chicago. It was a United Airlines Flight 232. About 37,000 feet in altitude, all of a sudden there was a big explosion. One of the engines blew up. Now, usually planes have, another 3 engines that they can continue with. But unfortunately, in this one, the explosion of the one engine affected the hydraulics on the other parts. So, consequently, they had to do an emergency landing in Sioux Falls City, Iowa. Well, they come into the landing airport and the airstrip about 100 miles per hour faster than a plane normally lands. But all the pieces are not working properly, and they skid down the runway and slide off into the grass, and seem like indefinitely they go through a cornfield. Now, they have cornfields in Iowa as well. And finally, the plane came to a rest. It's broken apart. Flames were going here and there. People were dying left and right. And Jerry was able to pull himself off that plane and move through the broken fuselage. And just as he exited the plane, he heard a cry of a baby. I've often said that babies have a penetrating cry, and I think God wired them that way, so make sure he can hear in case there's danger. And instinctively, he turned around, went back into the plane. Now, the plane was full of black smoke. He couldn't see anything. There was death on every side of him. And he listened to that cry and found a baby underneath a whole pile of luggage. He reached down, pulled it out, the child out, I should say, cradled the child in his arms, and exited the plane a second time. About 50 yards away from the plane, he finally looked down, and he noticed that it was a little girl in a little blue dress. Later, he learned that her name was Sabrina. That day, 121 people died. 184 people survived. About a month after that accident, Jerry received a thank you note and a photograph from little Sabrina's parents, Mark and Lori Michelson. They thanked him profusely for his heroism, because without him turning back and going inside, their daughter would have been one who has perished. Inside was a little picture, and he put it on his refrigerator. The interesting thing is each year at Christmas, Jerry received another Christmas card, thankful for everything he had done, and another picture of Sabrina, a little bit taller, a little bit bigger. He goes to the refrigerator, takes off the old picture, puts the new one with the magnet. Year after year after year after year of giving thanks. And Jerry often thinks, I will never forget that night. And little Sabrina will never remember it. Well, tonight, we want to remember a night to remember. And that is the focus of our whole service this evening, is focusing on the death of Jesus Christ and the cross and the sufferings that he endured for our sin. And what I'd like to do this evening is kind of review the last 24 hours of Jesus in about 24 minutes. We're going to climb into our F-35s, and we're going to scream across those incredible events. Now, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have a total of 89 chapters that tell us the story of Jesus. 13 of those chapters deal with the last 24 hours of the life of Jesus. There's lots of material, which tells us the focus of Jesus' intention in the gospel accounts. And we start off by remembering that Last Supper. And Jesus celebrates that supper with his disciples. Now, as we understand the story, he is celebrating Passover, a feast that's instituted with the Jewish people way back at the time of Moses in Exodus chapter 12. And they've been celebrating for years, millennia, looking forward to that. And as Jesus celebrates that Passover meal, he infuses it with new meaning. And he takes the bread and breaks it and said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Take and eat in remembrance of me." Then he takes the cup. Now, in the Passover meal, there's 4 different times that a cup is partaken of. There's what we call the cup of sanctification, the cup of affliction, the cup of redemption, and the cup of praise. And we believe that Jesus takes the cup of redemption and infuses that with new meaning, symbolizing his shed blood on the cross. And then he tells them, "Do this in remembrance of me." And we still do it 2,000 years ago, looking forward to the second coming of Jesus. Now, during this period of time of the supper, we find that Judas is dismissed. The rest of the apostles don't understand what's going on, but Jesus knows. He goes off to betray Jesus with the religious leaders. But the incredible thing about Jesus is that he begins to wash the disciples' feet. And the one who is going to die for them is the one who also is going to wash their feet, leaving us a model of sacrificial service to one another. That is what we call that special time of the Last Supper. Now, during that Last Supper time, we find that Jesus gives his last message. In John's Gospel, we find chapters 14, 15, and 16 is time where Jesus speaks without interruption. If you have one of those red letter edition Bibles, it's just solid red all the way through. And Jesus gives comfort to them. "Be not disturbed. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come back and receive you unto myself." And so forth. Even though they are feeling a little bit nervous, Jesus is the one who gives that comfort to them. He promises them a comforter, a counselor, the Holy Spirit, who would continue the journey with them, even though Jesus would not be there in physical presence. We find that he tells them that he is the vine and they are the branches, and they need to be connected to him in order to flow through and produce fruit that will last for eternity. Now, as he begins to do and continue this last message, we find he wraps it up in John 17 with what we call his last high priestly prayer. And Jesus prays to the God the Father, and he prays for himself because he knows what's coming. He prays for the 11 apostles, and he prays for future believers. People like you and me. And in his prayer, he prays for Whitewater Community Church. He saw it coming in time to be. Now, as Jesus wraps up this whole time with his disciples, they leave the city of Jerusalem. They go down to the valley of Kedron and up towards the Mount of Olives. But in the base of the Mount of Olives is what we call the Garden of Gethsemane. And that is where he invites his disciples to come and pray with him. But you know what happened? It was late. They were tired. And they fall asleep. And meanwhile, Jesus goes alone and begins to pray to God the Father. And we find that he is agonizing in prayer. And he cries out to the Father, "Not my will, but yours be done." And leaves us an example and a model that prayer is not always getting our way. But Jesus enters into that agonizing moment. Now, the Gospel of Luke, and Luke being a medical doctor probably takes special note of this, is that Jesus begins to sweat droplets of blood. It's a medical condition we call hematidrosis. Under extreme stress and pain and agony, blood will actually pass through the vessels and come out on our head. That's what Jesus was going through in his agony. When he finishes that prayer, it's almost as if he kind of checks his watch. It's almost like he's got an appointment. And he awakens disciples, and they go and meet a cohort who are coming to arrest Jesus there in the Garden of Gethsemane. In other words, Judas had connected with them and said, I will take you to where he is. And of course, Judas knew his pattern. And that's where they met him. And we find that Judas kissed him. And by doing that, he identified to those who were going to arrest him, the palace guard, who Jesus really was in the dark. We find that they take Jesus into the city of Jerusalem, again down the Kidron Valley, back up to the city walls itself and through that, and they begin to move through what we call a period of trials. Now, it's early in the morning, maybe before even dawn, and Jesus is going to go through a series of 6 trials. The first 3 trials are before the religious authorities, the Jewish authorities. The last 3 trials are before the Roman government and before we call them civil trials. And Jesus is going to be ramrodded through 6 trials in a matter of only a few hours. The first religious trial is before Caiaphas. Caiaphas was not the high priest, but he acted like it. He had been. He was kind of what I call the Jewish godfather. And he pulled all the strings and made things happen in Judaism. And he gave the word. Jesus was wrong. But he passes him on to his son-in-law, who was the actual acting high priest at that time, by a man by the name of Caiaphas. And Caiaphas and his group of Sanhedrin people said, yes, he is guilty. The only problem was, it was before 6 o'clock in the morning. Therefore, the trial was illegal. So they went through a third trial after 6 o'clock in the morning. It made it official. Jesus was guilty of being the Son of God, the King of the Jews. Unfortunately for the Jews, they did not have the power to crucify Jesus. And they wanted him gone, dead, good riddance. So the Jewish authorities had to take Jesus to the governing authorities, the Roman government, the civil powers. The first person they take him to is to Pilate. Now, Pilate listens to Jesus and questions Jesus and finds nothing wrong with Jesus and pronounces him guiltless. But that's not going to pass with these Jewish leaders. And they continue twisting his arm. In the process, Pilate learns that Herod Antipas is in town. After all, it's Passover week, and all these big officials, they show up in Jerusalem. Now, Herod Antipas is kind of a strange oddity. He'd always wanted to see Jesus because Jesus was from the Galilean region. The interesting thing is Jesus never says a thing to Herod Antipas. He's just silent. And Herod was kind of hoping for a magic trick. I heard you do miracles. Do one for me. Jesus is silent. So Jesus is passed back to Pilate for his last trial. And the Jewish authorities put pressure like he had never seen before. You need to crucify this man, or we're going to Caesar and we're going to tattle. Well, Pilate was between a rock and a hard place. He had already received a little message from his wife, have nothing to do with innocent man. So he tried to do some backpedaling, and he thought maybe a little beating up of Jesus would satiate these Jewish leaders. And that's where we move into what we call his mockery. What they did is they took Jesus outside to a courtyard. And there they began to put a crown of thorns on his head. Big, thick, heavy thorns. Sometimes we estimate probably 2-inch thorns. And they drove it into his scalp. And then they took a fake scepter, a rod, which has probably had the capacity of bamboo, and whacked him over the head with it, as well as on his back and his face, and began to mock him and to spit on him. And then they took what we call a cat of 9 tails, a whip with a short stick, stout, with all these leather ends on it with little bits of iron, metal, glass, and rock. And they thrashed him, which they often called the Roman half-death, because basically it takes you to an inch of your life. And when they had finished that, they were going to take Jesus to the place of the cross. And so they move on what we call a procession. Now, different religious artists and different historians show it differently. I usually envision that Jesus probably had the cross piece on his shoulders, the cross beam. And he had to move from this place where he was whipped to the place of actual execution. Now, keep in mind, he had had no sleep. He had lost all kinds of blood. He had sweated. He was dehydrated. He could not make it. And they probably thought, this execution will never happen unless we give him some help. And that's where a man out of the crowd by the name of Simon of Cyrene was conscripted to carry the crosspiece to the place of execution. We call it Golgotha, Calvary, the place of the skull. And that is where Jesus is crucified. Normal Roman crucifixion involved an upright beam that was laid on the ground. The crossbeam, with the prisoner himself carried normally there, was placed and affixed to that one long beam. Then the prisoner was laid on that cross that was down on the ground, and they would take his arm and feel for the two bones between the wrists. Many times in religious art, you find that Jesus had the nails in his hands. Well, if you put them in the hands, the body never could have held it. It would just fallen through. And sometimes people say, well, it says in his hands. Well, the Greek word for hands refers all the way from the hand to the elbow in the Greek language. So we believe it was probably between those two bones of the wrist. And they would stretch it out, and with a square wrought iron nail, they would poof right through into the beam itself. They would stretch out the other hand and do the same thing. Then they would take his feet and put one on top of the other and take a third square wrought iron nail, and with a mallet, they whoosh right through the feet. When they'd finish nailing him to those pieces of wood, they would lift it up with multiple soldiers and then deposit it in a hole in the ground, and kaboof, he'd be dropped there. That is the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, the strange thing about crucifixion is that no vital organs were impacted, all extremities. And what happened is that the body would begin to sag, and the knees would bend, and there'd be all kinds of pressure on the chest. And he was trying to breathe, but he couldn't catch his breath. So he'd push up on his knees in order to gather a little bit of a breath, and then waves of spasm would sweep across his pectoral muscles, and would have to slowly sag down again. And would do this over and over again just to survive. This is why the English word excruciating comes from the Latin meaning from the cross. One of the most cruel forms of death you can imagine. Jesus is on the cross from 9 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A total of 6 hours. While he's on the cross, there are 7 sayings that Jesus gave. We'll walk through those very quickly. The first one, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The cross is all about forgiveness. And that's what Jesus utters forth to those who are treating him in the worst possible way. And the cross is all about our forgiveness. of sin. The second saying is, today you'll be with me in paradise. As you remember the story, on either side of him are two thieves. One's repentant, the other is not. But the one repentant thief, Jesus turns and gives this promise. Today, you'll be with me in paradise. Can you imagine hearing that from a brother cross? The third one, Jesus says to his mother, dear woman, here is your son. Can you imagine watching your son go through this agony? And then he turns to John, we believe, we believe potential was his first cousin, based on his mother's relationship. Here is your mother. And what Jesus seems to be doing is passing the responsibility of the oldest son to his cousin John to take care of her. Now, the interesting thing is Jesus hangs on the cross during this 6-hour period. At the base of the cross are the soldiers. And the soldiers typically would like to attend these crucifixions. They were hardened soldiers. And they divide all the last little pieces that this person owned into 4 piles. You know, had his sandals and had his outer garb and inner garb and headdress, all of that. And then they would gamble to see who got what. And of course, the most precious one was the robe itself. And we find that Jesus was watching all of this. Now, as I mentioned, Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours. From about 9 o'clock to about 12 noon, everything seemed to be normal. Then around noon, something strange happened. From noon to 3 o'clock, everything went dark. That is the time of day when it's normally the brightest out. That day, it was the darkest. You can imagine wondering what's going on in this whole situation. Now, during this latter 3 hours, there are 4 more sayings that Jesus gives. My God, why have you forsaken me? He quotes Psalm 22:1. David writes that psalm. But yet Jesus is crying out to his Father, which tells us that he was receiving the sin of the world upon him, and God was turning his back on his Son during that period, in that moment. And then he cries out, I am thirsty. Now keep in mind the loss of blood, the sweat, the dehydration that must have went through this period of time. Well, quickly the soldiers ran up on a tall reed, a sponge, with kind of a narcotic vinegar drink to numb the pain. You remember Jesus refused it. He was not anesthetized while he was on the cross. He felt the full pain of it. The 6th saying is, it is finished. In the Greek language, it is the word tetelestai. Interesting enough, archaeologists have found all kinds of little pieces of pottery. We call that potsherds. They found them in tax offices. Instead of giving you bills and pieces of paper like we're used to today, they would give people potsherds as their bill. On some of those, there would be written the Greek word tetelestai, which literally means paid in full. You paid your tax debt. They would record it. And what Jesus is saying, he has paid the debt in full for our sin on the cross. Hey, yes. And then lastly, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. They didn't really kill Jesus. He laid his life down as a sacrificial lamb for you and for me. And around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus dies. After death comes burial. We find that two men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, requested permission to bury the body of Jesus. They were granted that permission. And they gave it what we call a typical Jewish burial. And what they would do is they'd take the body and stretch it out on a table of some sort and wash it. You can imagine what the body would have looked like. Then they'd take long linen cloths and strips, maybe a foot in width or so, and they'd lift the arms up and wrap it around the body, round and round and round and round. Then put the arms down and continue wrapping all the way around. So it became kind of like a mummy. In between those wrappings, they put kind of a pitchy substance of myrrh and aloes that weighed probably around 75 pounds itself. And when it was fully dried, it'd be kind of like a plaster of Paris cast that sometimes we put on an arm or a leg. And Jesus was encased, and then there was a separate head covering, as we understand. And then he was placed in a borrowed tomb of a man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. We believe that all happened before 6 o'clock in the evening on the day of Passover. And what we're going to do is we're just going to leave Jesus in the tomb. Throughout this weekend, I want you to remember and reflect on these 24 hours that Jesus went through as he suffered for you and for me. As we wrap this up, you probably have never heard of Dr. Kane, Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane. He was one of the chief surgeons at the Kane Summit Hospital in New York City, and he was a surgeon there for some 37 years. He did many, many surgeries when it comes to appendectomies, which were quite common 100 years ago. It's still common today. He'd probably done close to 4,000 of them. And when he did an appendectomy, what they often did was give general anesthesia. You know what general anesthesia was, especially in those era in that day, is they put you out. And there was risk and dangers in that, and Dr. Kane was a little bit bothered. He felt it might be more appropriate to do local anesthesia. So when they removed your appendix, you would be fully awake. Now, his big problem is he couldn't find a volunteer. Finally, one came forward. So they prepped him, cleansed him, got him ready, wheeled him into the operating room. We find that Dr. Kane found the spot where the appendix was, sliced open the skin, began to cut through the muscles, began to clamp off blood vessels one by one as it began to squirt, found the offending appendix, pulled it out, surgically removed it, and then stitched everything back up again. Now, what I did not tell you is that Dr. Kane was not only the attending surgeon, he was also the patient. He had done so many of those. He knew how to do it with his eyes closed, quote unquote. This all happened in February 15th, 1921, nearly 100 years ago. By the way, in 2 days, he was out of the hospital. Everything worked fine. The experiment worked. In a similar way, God had a problem. His problem was with our sin. God loves us, but sin keeps him away. And the solution was not surgery. It was death and resurrection. And it was Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, who volunteered to go forth and to pay the penalty for our sin. And that's what I want you to experience, that pain, that somberness, that darkness this weekend. This is what we call a night to remember. And we just want you to kind of keep that to some degree throughout this weekend. And then we're going to gather once again on Easter Sunday. And we're going to get Jesus out of the tomb. I want to ask our worship team to come back up here on the platform. We're going to make a transition here. We've got a special video of Fernando Ortega, who's going to sing and perform what we call O Sacred Head, Now Wounded. As he sings, I want you to enter into the spirit of that song, and then we'll pray and we'll dismiss you in a very quiet, somber fashion.